We are joined in the Beijing studio by Professor Xu Hui from China's National Defense University. Later, we also hope can get across to our guest in Washington, D.C. to have a discussion between China and the United States on our show as well. But for now, Professor Xu, let me ask you about this. We talk about the strategic part because the time when our show, live show, wraps up, it is the time the strategic dialogue and discussion begins in Washington, D.C. between China and the United States. The thing is, what can we achieve this time? Are we really going to face up to the real strategic mistrust?
I think this, the seventh strategic and economic dialogue held right before the coming visit of President Xi Jinping. So both sides agreed we have a very important job need to be done, that is facilitate the coming visit. And at the same time, I think it's unique chances for both the countries. You know, they sit together, the leadership of the both governments sit together. This kind of strategic and economic dialogue is unparalleled in the world, to my understanding.
All right.
You know, 16 ministers from U.S. side and 17 from Chinese side. Almost more than half of the ministers get together. They are the practitioners, decision makers also. So they will have the responsibility to give proposal to both of the president, and later on they have the responsibility to implement, you know, the orders from the two leaders.
Well,
so
if there are things that they can agree on, of course they're going to implement. The question is, will there be much to be achieved? Mr. Paul from Washington, D.C. Douglas Paul is the Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to our program. Mr. Paul, what do you think? Many say this SNED is to create, quote unquote, a positive energy, as the Chinese Vice Premier Wang Yang explained. But the thing is, what about the content?
The conflicts or context?
The content.
I'm sorry. Oh, the content is going to be fairly broad-ranging and substantial. We've got things to talk about across the whole scope of interaction between the U.S. and China, from the environment to human rights to cybersecurity, et cetera. So there's going to be broad content, but I think the goal is to set up some achievements that can be announced not this week, but in September when President Xi comes to Washington.
The U.S. side have already pledged, Mr. Paul, that it is not going to, together with China, paper up the differences or agree to disagree, but rather to really face up to the strategic mistrust issues. Are we really going to do that? How much do you think is likely to be achieved? Which area are you really looking at?
Well, achievements on the area of resolving our mutual mistrust will be very hard to accomplish during this week. You can be more frank, you can be more direct, and specify what your particular concerns are in hopes that the other side on these disputes can avoid direct conflict with us on them. But resolving, at least in the American culture, resolving a mistrust takes lots of accumulated actions. You don't do it in a session or a big set of meetings.
All right. This is not the one session. This is already the seventh session in a row over the past many years. Mr. Xu, we understand that Madam Liu Yandong passed it forward to the U.S. President Barack Obama a letter from our Chinese President, Mr. Xi Jinping, in which Mr. Xi illustrated about the importance, as he sees it, for the relations between China and the United States. He said this, he said that is going to be a priority in China's foreign policy going forward. The question is, President Xi from the Chinese side have long proposed the so-called a new type of great power relations between U.S. and China, but it seems that the U.S. has not necessarily responded specifically to their interpretations of this possibility. Do you think at this moment the specifics are important, or at the same time the strategic interpretations of the nature of the relations is as equally important in this regard?
Yes, it's very important. You know, Xi Jinping's, I think the letter sent a very strong message to the U.S., also to the world, I think, at large, that is China pay greater attention to this bilateral relationship. And also, although there are different interpretations of the new type of major power relationship, but we insist on to having such a kind of, at least a goal set up for the, the future relationships. That is no confrontational. I think that is very, very important because history told us that when these two countries get confronted with each other, no country will benefit from that and all suffers. So from this point of view, we can say that U.S.-China relations really is the most important relationship that provide the common goods for this region.
Well, I think the importance of it has all been recognized, but the thing is whether we are really looking at the strategic nature of this relationship and how both sides are interpreting this strategic nature. Mr. Paul, therefore, I would like to invite your expertise. Why is the U.S. reluctant, at least some say it, at this moment to give some specific interpretation of this, what the Chinese call a new type of great power relations? What exactly is the nature of this relation? If not interpreted, what is going to be the negative impact on some of the specific issues that we're facing right now?
Well, a couple of years ago, the U.S. Interpreted this phrase that comes out of China as meaning, this is at the Sunnyland Summit in California, as meaning the two countries agreed to avoid conflict, and to that extent the U.S. Subscribes to the concept. However, some of our allies have been very concerned that a new type of great power relationship would mean squeezing Korea and Japan out of our special relations in the Asia-Pacific region and replacing it with China. And the U.S. is reluctant to send that signal to the allies. So they've been much more muted on this subject. On the broader strategic picture, however, as you mentioned a moment ago, 7 meetings in 7 years, we've made tremendous progress on the economic front. The gap between us 7 years ago on how to maintain global growth and rebalance our economies has been slowed considerably through these meetings. On the security side, we've had more problems because China has become stronger and more active in the meantime, and so we've had more friction points rather than points of resolution.
Mr. Paul, since you talk about the allied relations U.S. has with some of the Asian neighbors of China, let's just put some spotlight on it. For example, whether the U.S. will be able to maintain its neutral position in terms of some of the bilateral territorial disputes, for example, China has with Japan, China has with the Philippines, is a big question mark facing China. Today, we are also looking at some of the joint military exercises the Philippines is having with Japan at this moment while the SNED is going on. So what is the nature of the U.S. promise to its allies in the region? How is that going to impact the U.S. promise to China to be neutral at the moment for territorial disputes bilaterally?
Well, this may sound very legalistic, lawyerly, but the United States distinguishes between its alliance obligations, which are really, in fact, to consult during periods of crisis or attack, not to beyond consulting, although there's an assumption the U.S. will do something after it consults with its ally over whatever the crisis is. But that's a separate matter from taking a position on the juridical outcome of disputes over territory in whatever part of the world. We don't get involved in those disputes unless we have a direct interest. How those disputes are resolved is the American interest. Doing that peacefully in accordance with international law is the repeated statement of the American administration and previous administrations. And I think that legalistic definition line will continue to be there.
Is, from your perspective, Professor Xu, the nature of the promise the U.S. made to its allies or for its alliance relations that much separated from the U.S. attitude toward some of the territorial disputes going on in the region?
Yes, as alliance systems, whatever they talk, I think is quite understandable. But whenever an alliance system related with the other parties, for say, in South China Sea or in Sino-Japanese relations, I think the Americans, while they concerned about the alliance, they also have to take into consideration of the feelings of China. I think from this point of view, Americans, to some extent, they pay too much attention on the so-called alliance and the commitment to the alliance. Even, for the consideration of the feeling of the alliance, they refused to have a definition of the U.S.-China relations as proposed by President Xi Jinping. I think that is negative for the relationship.
The big picture has already getting complicated even in our conversation. Therefore, Mr. Paul, let me throw in some specific one just to make it easier, or even maybe more complicated as a result. Let me talk about military ships, for example, in the South China Sea, and also the surveillance plane the U.S. sent over a month ago, which has been widely publicized, and also the U.S. position of the so-called freedom of navigation. All of these combined, what exactly is the U.S. attitude? I think both sides really need to look at each other in the eyes and try to figure out what each other is thinking. Mr. Paul, your thoughts?
Well, the U.S. position has really been unchanging for decades, that it insists on freedom of navigation as we believe it is defined in the law of the sea. It's called high seas freedom in the law of the sea, but we call it freedom of navigation. We tend to do our assertions of our belief that certain waters or airspaces are not closed to us quietly, without media, and periodically, so that the parties involved understand that we do have a different view about what navigation rights there are, if there is a difference with the other country concerned. This is going to continue for some time to come. Whether there should be camera crews on aircraft flying over the South China Sea, I think, is a policy judgment. It's one I would not have made, but there are things that the U.S. needs to do to assert its belief in freedom of navigation. Now, during this discussion in Washington this week,
that's right,
we haven't heard it in public, but I'll bet in private there's a very intense discussion taking place over the legal definitions that China brings to its claims in the South China Sea, and that others bring to their claims, and the U.S. sees as in its view of the law of the sea. China has been very reluctant to be specific about what it claims. One can understand that China wants to reserve negotiating room, but in fact we're not having any negotiations on these territories. One of the great problems is that it's so complex that it cries out for a diplomatic and political solution, not some legalistic solution.
All right. I'm so glad, Mr. Paul, at the end of your answer, you are not going back to the talking points from the U.S. side, but rather to provide some analysis. This is already getting difficult. Even in our conversation, Professor Xu, without relying on the talking points from the Chinese side, can you help us to shed some light about to what extent that the discussion can take place between China and the United States on the most important and the thorniest issues now facing these two countries, South China Sea?
Both sides agreed, I think. The South China Sea issue is not a issue between China and the United States on one hand. On the other, it's a small period between the general relationship between the two countries, over the disputes over there. But as to the freedom of navigation over the EEZ, I think I understand that it's very important for the U.S. foreign policy for instance, for intervention in some of the coastal areas in some other countries. So it's very important for the U.S. to implement their strategy of from the sea to the coast. Yeah, but we also notice that there's a lot of countries, oppose the U.S., activities in their coastal areas. I think there's a reason over there, because that sends a very hostile signal to the coastal countries.
Right. Well,
from this point.
We can see that both sides have very different opinions on this issue as well. Let me throw in a final question before we go. What about military-to-military exchanges, Mr. Paul? We have the economic and the strategic and the political. Meanwhile, we witness some improvements on mil-to-mil relations. As we all understand, that's probably where the danger is. And therefore, can that be elevated in the future to fit what the current situation is?
Well, the military-to-military dialogue is, in my view, extremely important. And it's something that has been, over decades, been subjected to winds that China will be uninterested when we are interested, and we are uninterested when China's interested. Fortunately, since President Xi came in, we've had much more consistent mill-to-mill contacts on both sides, and I hope that can be sustained. There's a long way to go for these two militaries to be able to sort of have a sense of predictability about each other's behavior so that we don't overinterpret or misinterpret what each of us does. And through exercises, we can get to know each other. And I hope current talk in Washington about sanctioning exercises because of something happening in the South China Sea, I hope the administration is smart enough not to succumb to that kind of temptation. The dialogue should go on even when times are tough.
I see. Professor Xu, your final words about this mill-to-mill, I guess that's where your expertise is as well.
I think there's a large potential for the two militaries to cooperate in the future. But unfortunately, in recent years, both sides pay too much attention on the negative sides of this relationship, especially the Americans, I think. They have a tendency to perceive almost all of the military activities, even the modernizations, as a kind of challenge to the Americans' security or the leadership of in Asia Pacific. I think only when they change this kind of mindset, we can have full cooperation, in dealing with the common, threats to us in today's world.
As both of you gentlemen have illustrated, there must be a lot of discussions taking place behind closed doors between China and the United States as S&ED discussions going on in Washington, D.C. At least in our studio, some real issues has already been thrown out and also being tackled for the moment. Thank you so much, Professor Xu Hui here in Beijing with us from China's National Defense University, and also Mr. Douglas Paul, Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us.